using up this space of mine. My head's stronger, now you're no longer using up this space of mine.
Stanley! Oh good, you're awake. It seems you had sort of dozed off there, drifting away into dreamland.
The title of Stanley Parable Deluxe Edition is kind of reminiscent of certain fighting franchises. Back in the day, like instead of DLC coming out or microtransactions, we used to just get slightly updated versions of prior titles. So you would get Super Street Fighter Turbo Hyper Fighting Edition on the Super NES or something, and that would be like this big event, and it would just make tiny tweaks to the main game design, and that would be enough to sell a whole ream of new copies. That was sort of a business strategy to pull people back in because you were guaranteeing at least some of what people loved about the original, but it's like we're catering now to more of what you wanted with that original. And this game has that implication. So starting out, just diving in, it feels like the game is sort of toying with the idea of like, is this going to be more of the same? And it does actually have the same in the sense it has the original game. So there's an initial prompt that asks if you've played prior titles, and this allows you to access the new content just a little bit quicker. And so after doing just 2 to 3 endings, you then get to see a big doorway that says new content on it, and that leads you directly to the Ultra Deluxe additional material. For players new to the game, this is a great way to discover Stanley for themselves. They can perhaps experience what I got to experience when the game first came out, which was a fourth wall breaking, slow-paced, recursive adventure about an office worker named Stanley, whose sole task is to hit buttons on command to follow instructions. Then suddenly the instructions stop and he has to contend with choice. And in so doing, he comes to the realization that choice can be limiting, isolating, dangerous. There's a cost to freedom. The first Stanley Parable was kind of an early attempt at meta commentary with video games. And that was fresh at the time. When it first came out, it would get a lot of attention for putting such a wide mirror on what games were always trying to do to the player, which was formulate an effective illusion to persuade the player that they were making more choices than they actually were, and to give the player a sense of agency that wasn't really there. At the bottom of every video game is a whole company-wide room of developers all struggling to orchestrate an experience in such a way that the player must experience that thing. And all of the attempts that the player makes to get out of that isn't really viable. Even though through the illusion of choice, the player feels as if, oh, I can just do X, I can just do Y, you know, and that would be me steering this experience.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
So much of the choice in games is a kind of free play within a limited set of constraints. That free play is just gradual shifts between those choices, but in the end, you're forced to choose. And the first Stanley Parable was like trying to make a meta commentary about that. And its meta-ness, the fact that it kept going outside of itself, that really felt special.
Coming to a staircase, Stanley walked upstairs to his boss's office.
This original Stanley Parable wasn't that long after BioShock. It's worth mentioning that like the ending of BioShock was so groundbreaking at the time because the whole point of that ending was to rub in our faces our lack of control in what we were doing. And even Shadow of the Colossus kind of does that. There was like this push toward meta commentary in games, and then Stanley Parable actually like originally committed to that. Sometimes the innovation of that initial commitment might overshadow the lack of actual substance beyond that initial comment. In the original Stanley Parable, if you're not into the humor, or if the commentary isn't as shocking as maybe it would be to some portion of the audience, then it may fall flat in many ways.
It sort of uses a technique that it's kind of designed to be simple, right? It's a time-tested kind of, but very effective technique of simplifying a problem and then conveying it in a form that is more extreme than reality. Obviously, games do allow you at least the sense of choice, but this game sort of strips you even of the sense of it. It makes you feel trapped, even as it's like hinting at the idea that you are making choices. The analogy that I would use is like it feels more like a choose your own adventure novel than a game, because that feeling that you get when you're reading a choose your own adventure novel and you make the wrong choice and you feel like, oh, I'm not reading the story anymore, I'm reading an ending. This doesn't feel like part of the larger thing. This feels like a side branch. The game sort of turns itself into nothing but a bunch of those little twigs, and it does so very consistently and I think very intentionally, so I do have to give it credit for that.
When you're actually told your constraints, when you're fully aware of all the limitations, you actually start to have more play within those limitations. With Stanley Parable, the feeling I had was like, okay, so I know what they want me to do now. There's a clear direction that they're pushing you toward in terms of go through the left door, walk up to your boss's office, and then it immediately makes very clear what the opposite choices are. And then it becomes about, okay, now I'm going to test the constraints that they placed. And they know that I'm going to test them. They know that the very first thing that I might do at the very start of any run is just close the door and sit in the office, and they maybe have a reaction to that. They know that I might press a button more than once, or purposefully turn back, or purposefully go the opposite of what the narrator tells me to do. And I know now, because they've made it clear to me that I should know, that okay, I'm going to just do that. I'm going to do that opposite thing, and you, the game, are going to react. There's some irony and honesty in the game just being upfront about what it's doing to you, and that actually gives you real control, just by being honest about your lack of control. It's one of the beautiful things about postmodern fiction generally. I mean, that's what always postmodern fiction is trying to do, right? It's like trying to take the wool from out of your eyes and just be straight with you, and just be kind of blunt about like, I'm trying to manipulate you. I'm trying to toy with your emotions. I'm trying to create a story that I know is fake, and I am arbitrarily placing these pieces together into some kind of structure that you're going to appreciate, and then you better be happy. But it's like, now I'm just going to tell you that I'm doing it. So now you can do it with me. Now we're in this together. There's a kind of partnership there. When Stanley Parable first came out, that was refreshing, a kind of partnership being developed there. So now we have this edition, this new thing, this ultra deluxe thing. Being ultra deluxe, you know, it implies that it's just a few little additions here and there, but this game starts to suggest something more.
Once this ultra deluxe new content really gets underway, it feels like it definitely has a different message. Thankfully, there is like a new idea here. The new ideas seem to be, they have a lot to do with like nostalgia and kind of like retreading ground, and the marketing tactics of, like you said, like adding a little bit of content and then calling it a new package, you know? A good chunk of the best content in the Stanley Parable Deluxe is about that specific message. There are some really cool moments. I think I preferred this content to the old content. It's about like a potentially harmful compulsion that people have to take the essence of something and distill that into like this mush of just memory and hype and nostalgia that kind of takes away the original thing that you enjoyed about what you're trying to recreate.
This game completely moves away from what the original game's message was, which was about player choice, and in some ways it gives the flipped or the reverse message about creator choice. Every creator, when they put something out into the world that no longer is theirs, it sort of becomes part of what the audience is wanting to see within it. And there's a kind of distance or a gap that immediately develops between the creator and the people consuming it. And this game is sort of toying with what happens to these video games. I would say what happens to any creation when you put it out there and it becomes special in the eyes of an audience. Suddenly there's a kind of pressure on the creator that wasn't there before. Like, imagine if you're someone who makes the Stanley Parable and you do this little meta message and you put it out there, and then you have more to say that is perhaps completely different. Because you now have an audience, you're alienating that audience by doing something different. You've trapped yourself by your own choice. It's an irony because, you know, the original game is about the player being trapped within choices, but I think that happens to creators too. If there's a deeper message in Stanley Parable, you know, beyond the message about marketing and beyond the message about franchises and consumerism, I found it personally in the idea that the creators of Stanley Parable are trapped by their own success. And there is a kind of wondering about, well, I like that feeling, I like that success. I like what I did, but I don't really fully know what I did. How do I do that again without actually alienating anyone? Because especially if what you did was special precisely because it was different, you're really trapped, because if you actually do something different again, it's not going to feel like the original. But if you actually do what the original did again, then you really aren't doing what the original did, which was something new. There's this memory room. One of the newest things in this sequel is you get some new content and you end up in this kind of memory space and you see a bunch of reviews of the game and you see like all these accolades around it, and that to me was capturing that feeling of being trapped by what you've done in the past. In one sense, it does kind of reflect on the same message that the original game had, which was your choices are necessarily limited. There's an irony to freedom, which is that the more free you are, the more choices you make, which then take away your freedom. You walk through one door and you can't go through the other. And that's what the creators sort of bounded themselves into with this one.
One of the interesting new ideas that this game presented is in probably my favorite ending that it has. The narrator sort of, takes you to that memory room, and then you end up in a room that is just an enclosed space with surrounding a button, and it's the skip button. It's just the button that allows you to skip forward in the conversation and sort of shut up the narrator and get to the next part.
And it was precisely in response to negative reviews that complained about the narrator being too long-winded.
And here it is. Go ahead and give it a shot. I'll pop you forward in time so that the second my incessant droning starts to bore you, with just the push of a button, you'll have zipped right past it. It's what the players have been asking for.
It's a moment that you can only experience one time, and that is determined entirely by your whims. You can press the button as many times as you want, as fast as you want, or you can wait a really long time and see what the narrator has to say. The creator doesn't get to control that anymore. It gave me that sense that like the best games do, where I feel like I'm having my own experience with the game. And it was just kind of beautiful. I felt like I was able to pace it in a way that I found dramatic for me. I thought it was really sad how the narrator sort of deteriorates over time, and he starts making less sense, and he starts pleading with you, and then things get worse and worse, and you end up in an empty desert. It is the kind of thing that made me have high hopes for this game, right? Because I thought like, well, this is going to be about so much more than just that original idea.
For once, it was really giving the narrator character. I mean, the whole point of that button, he was reacting to critiques of the past games saying that he was annoying. And he said, well, if you think I'm annoying, if I bother you, then I'll give you the right to skip. It's a sad offer. It's like he's in a relationship with you and he's saying like, oh, okay, that part of my personality bothers you. I care for you, so here's my compromise with you. But as part of that compromise, it is a compromise of himself. Right? It's like saying like, I'm rejecting this part of you. And if you really commit to it, like if he really commits to compromising with you, it requires him to sacrifice more than you're sacrificing. And it's sort of this sad like relationship, this one-sided relationship. It really felt like a character for a limited period of time. One of the things that's a little disappointing, a little sad about where this game ends up is that is such a striking moment, because it really goes to places that felt new in comparison to the past game. And then by the game's nature of being a repeating loop, you end up immediately going back to the old version of the narrator after you finish that ending. So you get to see this narrator be like really open and sad, and then it's like all that progress goes away and you're just back to like experiencing the jokey, humorous side. One thing that's really sad about the way the narrator's talking to you is there's a kind of neediness that he seems to recognize, because every time you hit the button to skip, time passes where he can't be heard by you. And it's sort of this sad thing, because him speaking, he actually makes this point at one point, like he could just keep talking. There is no difference, right? He could either talk and you can sit there silently and listen, or he can talk and have no one there. And the exact same action has completely different meaning to him when you're actually listening or not. And so he begins to realize, after you keep pressing this button and skipping him, and he keeps experiencing the sensation of talking to no one, that he really needs to be heard.
I know you can't hear me once you push that button. That's what I'm realizing now, Stanley. I'm realizing that I needed to know that someone was listening. I needed there to be a vessel through which my words were moving. It was the vessel I needed, Stanley, not the outcomes, not the story. None of that matters anymore. I'll give it all up. I'll give up every branching path. I'll burn my story to the ground. One single thing I need, and God, I can see now that I need it more than anything, is to know that someone else is taking it in.
And again, this goes back to like this overall message about creating something. Like it's almost like Stanley is like trying to get something out of himself and just have it be recognized by someone. And when you decide to skip past it, you're really taking away the one thing that any creator needs, which is potentially to just have a relationship with someone, even if they're not responding. I mean, that's the funny thing about Stanley, is he's always quiet. Like so much of the audience that you create a game for is quiet, or that you write a story for is going to be quiet. And there's going to be these loud few on the margins, but the vast majority are going to be silent, and just knowing that they're there is meaningful. But but then that creates a neediness where you then start to sacrifice who you are in that process. If there's a deeper meaning, the marketing section, the section where you actually end up in what the game starts to call Stanley Parable 2, right? And it starts to suggest like this is the sequel. That whole section is all about how do we market so that people will keep being interested in us. I think the narrator's desperation to be heard is very much like the game creator's desperation to be relevant and interesting. And it becomes like, well, what does that feel like to try and do that? And unfortunately, the feeling ends up being a kind of dumbing down of what actually made your thing special, what actually made what you made worth valuing in the first place.
The more we talk about this moment, the more I enjoy it, because there's so much to discuss just about that theme of like removing your own control as a creator in order to provide control to a consumer of your work. There is a sacrifice that you have to make. And like any sacrifice, it has two sides to it. It has this tragedy of you're losing something and you feel like you wish that you had it back. You wish you had that control and that sense of like knowing that someone hears you and knowing how they hear you and knowing how they interpret you. But in losing that, you give the viewer something that they weren't going to have if you took full control. They get to participate and they get to have a more sort of personal relationship. And not only does that moment discuss that in such a great way, like I think it's well written, and I want to point that out. Like it's a really nicely written thing that I think had a lot of thought put into it. But on top of that, it's also from a gameplay perspective, something that really gives you the freedom to have a personal response to something. Because of the way that it's set up, because of the way that it's not about binary choices anymore. It's just about making your little judgment about what kind of story you want to tell with the skip button.
There's this exhibition hall. The game starts really diving deep into the humorous nod and a wink about what this game is. And in this case, it's sort of saying like, look, we're milking a franchise. And I know it's critiquing that. That's what it's trying to do, is it's trying to say like this is what games do, is they reach their level of success and then they have to milk all these little pieces of themselves. And the game is showing you, look at all these new ideas, and it's clear that each of the ideas is meant to be a gimmick. It's not meant to be substantive. It gives things like, look, we have a bucket, a reassurance bucket that you can hold and it makes you feel better while you play. We have an infinite hole that you can fall down, and look at that, it keeps going forever and ever. And then we have a button that will say your name, and we have a circle where you can finally jump. Look, this was a feature that was never in the original game. And the thing that is funny about each one of those examples, and there's a few more, they all don't live up to the sale of them. They're all sold as this remarkable little addition, and then every single one is limited in some way. And that's clearly a commentary on like the quantity of features that gets thrown into sequels that are clearly thrown together in such a way where the creative spark is missing. And so it just ends up being kind of a half-formed version, but what you're sold is the full-formed version.
I thought there's definitely some funny stuff in that. I think the funniest one to me is the bottomless hole, this parody of like the idea of endless replayability in a game. Where in order to make something infinite, you have to make it completely hollow. And so it's just an endless hole. I think that's really funny.
As you're falling down this hole, and it's like, look, it's like endless content, right? Are you falling? You then just get to put filters over it. You can put filters of music, and it's like, we're changing your perspective. They have all these little buttons you can press, and it changes the music, and it changes the color of everything, and it changes the background. And it's like really the same thing, just with different superficial variations thrown on top. That is a pretty funny meta commentary that just kind of threw in. During the exhibition section, I thought like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like this actually is a sequel to Stanley Parable. Like I'm really going to get something totally new here. But after you go through all the features, you eventually hit like a room of collectibles, and it sort of makes a joke about like, look at this thing, you can collect a bunch of stuff and you can make choices about like what kind of new game you want. And then the game will eventually thrust you back into the original Stanley Parable. And the only way to recognize that it's new is because there's some balloons that you had picked in the exhibition hall. And it's like, okay, so there must be new stuff. And you can very quickly get the little reassurance bucket. It's like, okay, this game is new. But that's when I started to get a little disappointed. And it's funny for us to be critiquing this and to say it's disappointing because we know that literally that's what the game was making fun of, is like critics like not getting it, and like, but I really strongly did feel disappointed.
It's unfortunate that the reassurance bucket specifically would result in so much repeated content that is essentially just rewritten with the idea of a mysterious bucket that might have some sort of like eldritch horror background to it or something. It's one joke that gets kind of repeated over and over, and those jokes are themselves overlaid over repeated content from the Stanley Parable original. It really actually seems like the bucket might be the key to more of what you saw before, more of what was leading up to that, which was actually a lot of really interesting lead up. My opinion is that I was very disappointed, and I think it probably could have been done better. But you do bring up a good point about, like, obviously that is the whole idea of it.
It is doing the exact thing that it says it's doing. It's like, look, we're demonstrating to you what games do is they take the original magic and they just will throw a few little bells and whistles on it and call it new. And to be fair to them, they didn't sell this game as Stanley Parable 2. That is something that pops up halfway through and gets you really excited and makes you think it's going to be new, but that is the joke. Because what they actually are selling you really is just a deluxe edition of Stanley Parable. It really is mostly the first Stanley Parable. And then there's new stuff, but it's in the same spaces as Stanley Parable 1. So half of the content feels old. I know that that's the joke. Like, I'm not the naive critic. Like, I get it. That's kind of the point. And it certainly nails that point home.
It ends on the worst note partly because by being a combination remake of Stanley Parable and sequel to it, it ends up being about, first of all, the themes of the original, which is lack of choice. Then also the themes that I really enjoyed about creativity. And then the third and final sort of point that gets driven home is, isn't it annoying to experience hollow content over and over? It's not just ideas being thrown around. You actually have to go through having your time sort of wasted. And I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I don't mean that the game harmed me or that it ruined my week. But it would have been nice if that was in the middle, if that was just a thought, rather than kind of the whole experience that peters out at the end. I do think there is just a structure issue where it's sort of a guarantee that the last content you're going to experience is the bucket repeats. It's tragic. I think there is some really cool stuff that I'm glad that we could at least talk about besides the bucket stuff, because there really is cool stuff.
If they make a Stanley Parable 3, I really hope they include audio of us talking about this Ultra Deluxe Edition. Because clearly we clearly don't get it.